Hi, all. We're back, and I'm bringing back right now the Garo crucifix. So I showed this to you last week as an example of sculpture that was made during the rule of the various emperors Otto, known as the Ottonian period. And you may remember, and if not, let me remind you, that this sculpture of the crucified Christ would have originally hung above an altar, and in that way, it would have reinforced to the believer the connection between the crucified Christ and the ritual taking place at the altar, which commemorated that very act, that is Christ's sacrifice, and the ritual, of course, being Eucharist or communion. So I want to talk a little bit more about sculpture that would have been found near or on altars. And specifically, we're going to look at this period when pilgrimage, that is, the journeys taken by Christians in the Middle Ages to sites where they could physically touch or just be nearby the relics of saints. And so when you went on pilgrimage and you went to see the relics of a saint, you weren't just seeing a pile of bones, they would be contained. And here are just examples. So here you might discern that this would have originally held the arm bone of an important saint, and thus the container looks like what, in fact, the bone would have looked like when the saint was still alive. Here is a reliquary. That's the name given to containers of relics. And this particular reliquary would have housed the skull of a saint. And so I bring this up because as we've already seen in kind of our little brief survey of medieval church architecture, very often a large church or cathedral would have several altars in it, not just the main altar, and each altar might have, in fact, a reliquary or a sculpture of some sort located there. So the sculpture we're going to look at is made of both metal and of wood, precious metal, I might add. And the first one we're going to look at is the reliquary or container of the relics of Saint Foy. And translated, that would be, her name would be Faith. And yes, she would be a she. And the story of Faith was that she, in fact, lived back when essentially the Roman Empire was still in power. And she had been, I think the story goes, she'd been promised to some local pagan man who said, "Okay, Faith, you're going to be my wife, you child, you. And by the way, I'm pagan, you're going to be pagan." And this faithful child said, "No, no, no, I'm a Christian." And then they threw her in jail and probably tortured her. And ultimately, the term is recanted. She never recanted her belief in Christianity. So, fast forward a few years, her relics were very carefully kept, no, not in a container quite as fancy as this one. And then there were miracles that became attached to her remains. And the miracles were everything from, I believe, the locals believe she raised a donkey from the dead, and she became a particularly an object of devotion, particularly for those who had been unjustly imprisoned. So think about it. It's the 1100s. Your no count sibling is in jail. You might go to her relics. You might say a prayer. You might leave a little money offering, which was customary in the pilgrimage process. And the hope would be that your sibling, your whatever, would be released from jail. So, in terms of the container, the reliquary itself, as you see, it's kind of this extraordinary combination of gold, and I do mean like gold. When gold is in its purest form, it's quite soft. And so this is no doubt gold leaf that's covering a wooden sculpture. It, by the way, is about nearly 3 feet, and it shows us Saint Foix, Saint Faith, enthroned. That's key. We're going to see some more enthroned figures in a minute. And she herself is covered in jewels and pearls. And the interesting thing is that some of these jewels actually date back to the Roman Empire. So it's that notion of kind of co-opting the objects of pagans and incorporating it into this sacred object. So yeah, she was uh, actually, as a reliquary, she lived in one church, and some members of a competing church stole her under the cover of night one night in the 1100s. And when the original church, discovered she was gone and they suspected the culprits, when they confronted the culprits, they're like, hey, dudes, if Saint Foix wanted to hang out in your church, she would have gotten herself back there, but clearly she wants to be with us. Okay, so let's look at another sculpture you would have found on an altar, not one though that, as far as we know, ever held relics. And in fact, upon first glance, you will notice that this is not a sculpture made of precious metals and jewels, but rather a sculpture. Again, I'm going to say about 3 feet, but carved of wood. And this case, it's, as the label would indicate, Virgin and Child. It's an image of Mary and Christ, and Mary, like Saint Foix, is seated on a throne. So when we take a look at these two, we'll notice in this detail, first of all, this wooden sculpture was originally painted, and you can just see traces of blue in the folds of Mary's robe. And Mary kind of traditionally was depicted in blue robes. And the folds, of course, though, are just a series of parallel lines. Gone is the impulse to depict a body under the drapery, as we saw in Greece and Rome. This is not that time. This is the Mother of God. You don't need to worry about her looking like a person. We are depicting her as a powerful being. Here's Christ, and fits on her lap, and he himself has suffered some damage. He's lost some of his arms, but you might notice that he, despite his rather diminutive size, does not, in fact, look like a baby. In fact, he looks like a little man. And that is because this particular image, despite the fact that Christ is sitting on Mary's lap, this is not Mary, mommy of a baby. This is Mary who enfolds Jesus on her lap, who becomes visually almost kind of a seamless whole with this throne she sits on. And in that way, it's not so much Mary as mommy to Jesus, but Mary as the source of wisdom. And so we've encountered this before. The Latin is sede sapientiae, and the idea being that Christ is the embodiment of wisdom. Mary was the source of Christ, and thus Mary is the kind of throne of wisdom. Now, we've seen this. We saw it all the way back in mosaic, in sparkling gold mosaic and the Hagia Sophia. And so this idea of Mary as this incredibly powerful, very sacred being persists. And now we're looking at, for 6 centuries nearly. So, which really brings me to Mary. So you'll recall in the last video lecture, we were looking at the cathedral dedicated to Mary, Chartres. And I mentioned that most cathedrals, those large city churches built from the 1100s on were dedicated to Notre Dame or Our Lady or Mary. Those are all the same. And this would indicate something that we call the cult of Mary that really takes hold after about the year 1000, maybe even around 1100. So, to get an idea of what this means, and again, let me hasten to add cult in this context isn't sort of like some kind of freakish uh, splinter faith, but rather a particular devotion within the larger world of Christianity. So let's take a look at this. Now we see Mary, we see Christ, she's standing. So this is not a throne of wisdom. And in fact, if we look at the detail, first we see she's depicted quite young and beautiful, and Christ is very evidently a baby here. He's not quite the middle-aged man he seemed to appear in our last sculpture. So just to show you a comparison. And certainly in the image of Mary on the left, she is made of silver that's been with a kind of coating of gold on the outside. What you may not be able to see very clearly is that in her right hand, she is holding the symbol of France, which is called the fleur de lis. And so this is a Mary again in another kind of guise or another particular depiction. This one was very, very popular in starting really around 1150, 1190, definitely throughout the 1200s and 1300s. Why? Well, because if you were, uh, a faithful Christian in the Middle Ages and you were asked to, pray to God. Well, God seems like an utterly distant and difficult to comprehend supernatural being. And even Jesus Christ feels distant and kind of hard to grapple with. But now Mary at her core is a mama. And the church realized that as hardship comes along, and believe you me, in the 1200s, it's nothing but, failed crops and dying, babies dying and so forth. Comfort could come for the believer when they saw something that truly they recognized, which is a nurturing mom. So we move from an earlier depiction, such as that one on the right, which kind of falls within that same period we were characterizing as the Romanesque when we were talking about architecture. And that shifts, so we shift from Mary as this, throne of wisdom to the image depicted on the left where it's Mary as a young mother. So, so I'm going to end with a last image of Mary, one that is truly kind of arresting, and this takes us into the 1300s. And it is Mary holding her grown son, who has since been taken from the cross, so the broken, lifeless body of her son. This particular image is called a Vesper built, and it was created in what we would call today Germany. And we get this very stark image of a mother in grief. And here is a detail of Mary's face. So again, as with the other wooden sculpture I've shown you, this one has been painted. It's also been beset by insects, as you can see in the little holes that have been bored into the head there. But yeah, so here we have an image of just abject grief and just sadness from a woman who's had to witness the death, the actual execution of her grown son. And here are some details of Christ, where the polychromy, that is the paint used on the wood, enabled the sculptor here, we don't know who, to emphasize the blood on Christ's forehead from the crown of thorns. And then we get kind of sculptural with the blood, the stigmata, that is the marks in the Christ's hand and the place where Christ was pierced by the Roman soldier Longinus. And so when confronting an image like this, the believer is not there to think young, lovely mother with baby, but rather a kind of portrait of loss and grief sustained by also Mary. And for someone who's in fact in a place of great sorrow or fear, an image like this would potentially provide a great deal of comfort, a kind of notion that, well, look what Mary went through, and now I'm going through a pandemic. And so, or, that seems to be as good an example as any. And so in the Middle Ages, there were pandemics, the big one being, of course, the Black Death or the plague. And that, interestingly, is when images like this first really took hold, is as people were dying by the hundreds. And of course, without any kind of understanding of how such a disease worked, people relied upon their faith to get them through. So the sculptures we've looked at here remind us that the altar, while it was a site for ritual and for the priest to read and conduct the mass, it was also a site for sculpture. And sculpture could be reliquaries, as we've seen, or it could be these devotional pieces specifically for Mary. Okay, that's it, folks. Bye bye.